Welcome back to AAKP's National Kidney Patient Consumer Policy Roundtable, the critical need to overcome government determinants of health. For those of you just joining us, my name is Ed Hickey. I'm the president of AAKP, chair of the Veterans Health Initiative, and a fellow kidney patient. We have a tremendous discussion already, and coming next, we'll be transitioning to some critical issues in transplantation. Our next discussion topic, we're going to focus on the long and winding road, FDA's decades-long effort to jumpstart the next generation of transplant drugs. AAKP believes transplanted kidneys should last as long as possible. Kidney transplants are the preferred therapy over dialysis for kidney failure. This is both a national policy consensus and a medical priority. For the past 10 years, AAKP, alongside allied transplant professionals and industry, has supported efforts to find new pathways and clinical endpoints for therapies that will increase the survivability and long-term outcomes of transplanted kidneys. But the vision of a new generation of transplant drugs will never become a reality without the sustained interest and commitment of every FDA office involved in transplant drug development and approval. And it will never become a reality if myths about the status quo of transplant medicine are not dispelled. The status quo of organ transplantation, including organ failure, retransplantation, or a return to dialysis and premature death, is unacceptable. So too are status quo transplant drugs, none of which have a long-term clinical outcome measure beyond 1-year graft survival. Some drugs have devastating side effects, including cancer and even harm to the transplanted organ. Some FDA leaders have stated the importance of informing FDA decisions with patient needs and insights. Yet over the course of nearly 10 years, FDA has listened to the unmet needs of transplant patients and has failed to take meaningful action to jumpstart the next generation of transplant drugs. Joining us to speak more about this issue are two highly talented and very strong advocates for increased transplantation and greater opportunities for transplantation across historically underserved communities. Live and remote from his transplant center, we have our friend Dr. Kenneth Newell, professor of surgery and program director of the Division of Transplantation at Emory University School of Medicine. Dr. Newell is a thought leader in improved transplant outcomes and a committee member for the Transplant Therapeutics Consortium. Dr. Newell is joined by my friend and AAKP Ambassador Kevin Fowler, founder and CEO of The Voice of the Patient and a pre-emptive kidney transplant recipient. Kevin is the author of a series of articles chronicling FDA's public commitments and meetings on this issue over the past decade. Kevin is a voice of moral clarity on unmet transplant patient needs. Dr. Newell, I know that at any moment you may be called into surgery. And as a transplant surgeon, you can share your perspective on the status quo in transplant drugs and why transplant professionals need tools to improve long-term transplant outcomes. Do we have Dr. Newell?
Well,
There he is.
Mr. Hickey, let me start by thanking you and AAKP for inviting me to participate in what I think is a very important conversation that has spanned, as we've heard, years. You can tell by looking at me, I'm not a young man anymore. There's not many advantages to aging, but one is you have a sense of history. When I began my surgical training, the rejection rate for patients following a kidney transplant was 90%. And the survival of a kidney at 1 year was half of that. And so there was a critical unmet need for new endpoints, and new endpoints were developed. And those endpoints got us to where we are today, which is rejection rates in single digits and kidney survival meeting or exceeding 95% in many settings. So that's a remarkable story of success in improving short-term outcomes. But once we got better short-term outcomes, the focus appropriately and perhaps belatedly began to focus on long-term outcomes. not just graft survival, but graft function, how people feel, the economic cost to patients and their families. And yet we're using an endpoint that's 9 decades old. You know, we don't use that in our cars, right? Your car now looks far different than your car did in 1984. And other fields have taken advantage of innovation to come up with new endpoints that really address what I think now is a great unmet need, which is what's the long-term outcome of a transplant? And if we don't have a measure that allows us to assess that, we're just shooting in the dark. And so I think that one of the great needs now is to come up with an outcome measure that helps us predict quality of life, function of the graft, and important things to patients, providers, insurers, focusing on these long-term outcomes.
Thank you. And briefly, can you tell us what decision is pending before the FDA on the clinical endpoints and how patients and surgeons will be impacted if the FDA fails to move forward with this?
Yes. So beginning nearly a decade ago, not quite, professional organizations, along with leaders in industry, regulatory agencies, and patients, formed the Transplant Therapeutics Consortium. The goal of this was to develop new tools to advance drug development in the transplant space. One of these tools is something called the iBox. It's a composite measure of multiple things that detect the immune response to the kidney, injury to the kidney, function of the kidney. The important thing, without getting into any of the details, what comprises this, is it's been well validated scientifically that the iBox measures things at 1 year that predict outcomes at 3, 5, 7 years. And so when you start thinking about what this means, we can't do a study that takes a decade. It's just not feasible. But we could do a study, look at measures at a year, and if that reliably predicts long-term outcomes, you could use that as a tool to begin to develop therapies that move those goalposts. You know, I think it's very clear, whatever your target is, you need an endpoint that reflects that. When our target was, we've got to make 1 year short-term outcomes better, we developed a tool. But you can't use that tool on your next goal, which is to say, we need to improve long-term outcomes. And I think, I didn't say it, but despite the remarkable improvement in short-term outcomes, improvement in long-term outcomes hasn't kept pace. And that's why I think this is now such an important topic.
Well, thank you. Kevin, you're a unique advocate because as a professional, you've worked inside the drug industry. What signal does it send to drug makers in the kidney space if the FDA fails to meet its commitment to jumpstart the next generation of transplant drugs?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thanks for the invitation today, and I want to thank AAKP for taking the lead on this issue, because this is really an important issue, as Dr. Newell pointed out. I'll go back to when I started working in transplant for Astellas back in 2007, December of 2007. There were 3 companies in the field of transplant. There was Astellas Pharma, there was Novartis, and Cellcept. All 3 of those companies have exited transplant. And it comes down to, a business decisions that you make. And I think what Dr. Newell is talking about right now is the importance of having regulatory direction. Because if you're going to come into an area, as Dr. Newell said, the company's not going to come in and look at a 10-year trial. The purpose of having regulatory direction is to limit the risk and to make it attractive to investment. And it really comes down as simple as that, is that you have to have a pathway. And I completely agree with everything what Dr. Newell said right now, is that it's really, I'm finding this hard to believe after attending that meeting in November of the FDA, that there wasn't clarity on the iBox. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the implications of having surrogate endpoints, look at the field of nephrology, look at IgA nephropathy, classic case, community coming together, developing surrogate endpoints, reduce the risk, and now you have over 9 clinical trials for IgAN. I mean, that's exceptional. We're just begging to get 1 trial going in transplant, in kidney transplant. So anyway.
All right, well, thank you. And one final question. What signal does it send to patients on dialysis, patients on the waiting list, and organ donors if after nearly 10 years, FDA decides against moving forward in the new transplant drug development?
I think what it sends a message that you don't matter. And I think we heard that message earlier from Dr. Williams, who was speaking about that. I think that's what it really says, is that you don't matter. And I think what is, to me, I find was just appalling is that when I left that meeting back in November, there was a lack of urgency from the FDA. And I just want to make one thing perfectly clear is that dialysis is not an acceptable alternative. It's not. It's an early, slow death sentence. And if you ask kidney transplant recipients, and this has been studied by Dr. Allison Tong, is that when people that had a transplant and faced the prospect of going back on dialysis, patients prefer death over going on dialysis. So I think what my request is that if the FDA is not going to have a sense of urgency, I can assure you that AAKP and the rest of the people in this room are going to have a sense of urgency because the status quo is unacceptable.
Great. Well, thank you for those words. And thank you, Dr. Newell. We appreciate your participation in this. And for everyone watching, please visit AAKP's Action Center and sign our petition, "The Transplant Therapeutics and Innovation Must Evolve." You can also learn more about this issue by downloading and reading and learning resources from the digital agenda and QR codes, or pick up copies at the registration table in the back. Learning about critical issues impacting kidney patients and then taking action to alert your elected leaders is what makes you a kidney voter.